Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today, again, we'll be talking about Afghanistan and the Afghan Papers. I previously did a video on it. If you want to know what the Afghan Papers are, go watch the first 3 to 5 minutes of that video. But if not, I'll give you this condensed version of it. The Afghan Papers were basically the behind the scenes look, all these officials, mainly American, across different organizations, doing interviews with SIGAR, the Overwatch organization set up by the US government in 2008 for Afghanistan's reconstruction. And basically, the Washington Post got all these interviews and the transcripts, which basically helps you understand the non-glossy press conference version of the Afghanistan war straight from the horse's mouth. So today we will be talking again about the Afghan Papers, and today we will be talking about the ANA and the ANP's corruption, the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police, along with the government and sort of the local police too. I won't really be touching on the American government side of the corruption, other than the obvious fact that they completely fueled it by, being responsible of funneling billions into the country, directly funding the police, the army, training them, basically putting the government in, and all these sorts of things. So the corruption here isn't just financially, it's morally, it's every way it can be. Some of the examples are something got spoken about over a good few years, ghost soldiers, where basically there's a bunch of soldiers or police on the payroll written down, but they don't actually exist. They're just a paycheck for the commanders. People bought positions to then use the power to take even more money. Police were setting up checkpoints. The army was setting up checkpoints, like a toll booth. A Norwegian official basically said 30% of the Afghan National Army would take all the weapons, drop out, and then set up their own checkpoints. It also sort of ties into warlords basically being put in the government by the US because they didn't, they basically needed to persuade them to give up their small militias and they would join the government. So there's literal, basically criminals in there. And again, they obviously not the most innocent people. And there was always the question of, are they involved with the opium trade? To the point, this corruption's so rife that the Afghan people, through these interviews and other people, basically said that they're just waiting to see who wins. You have on one side a completely corrupt government that they don't trust, that can't really help them. And then you have the Taliban, who are brutal, who they also don't like, but they actually like the fact that through the 90s up to 2001, they got rid of all the warlords and corruption through brutality. So they see here basically, a puppet US government that's meant to do all these things, but they're basically the same as the Taliban, except they actually have the full force of, legality and legitimacy behind them. And then you've got the Taliban, and they're just looking both ways and going, they both kind of suck. We're just going to wait it out. And that's just how bad it is. And that's not just through the interviews. An Afghan advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff laid this out perfectly.
And the first element was corruption that you pointed to. Can you explain the mechanism? How is it that corruption leads to the fall of the Afghan government?
In simple terms, why would a population take risks to fight the Taliban on behalf of a government that is treating them almost as badly as the Taliban do? So Afghan government officials would shake people down at every interaction. The massive international funding that was arriving in the country was being siphoned off or captured by government officials and their cronies. And from Afghans' perspective, it almost looked like the United States was in favor of this system because our officials were always seen partnering with these venal Afghan leaders. And no matter how much the population complained, they really couldn't get us to address the issue seriously.
What role did the U.S.'s actions play in this? Did we hinder the corruption? Did we help the corruption? Did we try to stop the corruption?
I have to say, on balance, we enormously helped the corruption. As I say, first of all, by allowing local strongmen to capture the revenue streams. So, for example, you'd have one local strongman who's providing security at a U.S. base, and then he would only allow his people into our contracting conferences, for example. We never held any of the officials that we were partnering with to account. I would say that toward 2009, 2010, we began to catch on to this as a serious issue. And so a decision was made to do a test case with plenty of evidence. It was brilliantly mounted, and it had to do with a whole of approximately $900 million in Kabul Bank, right? So we're talking a significant issue here. And the person targeted, who was taking a bribe, was in the palace, was close to President Karzai. Well, as soon as President Karzai threw a fit about the arrest of his henchmen, Washington basically executed a U-turn. And the US never took corruption seriously after that. That was in 2010. In 2011, when I was working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there was an interagency policy process that would arrive at a determination how was the United States going to address corruption. And explicitly, it was decided that we were not going to focus on any of the high-level corruption, only, quote, street-level police corruption, which, of course, was the purview of the military.
So again, that was an advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She also spent time in Afghanistan, and she's also very critical there of the American role. And she also mentions the Kabul Bank. And this Kabul Bank was described by an official in one of these papers as something out of a spinal, and the corruption was not 10 out of 10, it was 20 out of 10, and it was like a self-perpetuating system that benefited the same people. And many officials recount how it was not held accountable in the end, as many things were. So let's jump into this. Hopefully it's going to be a shorter video than last time. I'm going to show some less quotes, but a lot of them are quite remarkable, as last time they were. Some strong words about the police and the army, and just the general lack of trust in the government, basically always having to look over your shoulder, and describing, someone says, the Afghan local police were the bottom of the barrel of a society that they really at the bottom of the barrel. So, make of what that what you will, but they're saying, a society he considers the bottom of the barrel, obviously, in the world. The people, they're meant to be fighting justice and, probably funding at that bottom of the barrel, which, plays into the bigger picture of the whole war, that, these little pieces, the lack of trust in the government, the fact that they were still corrupt, the fact they had no loyalty, that they, basically move over to the Taliban or whoever's, more beneficial at the time, was the reason this war wasn't successful. And obviously there's so many different factors. And in the Afghan papers, you see, little bit Pakistan's double role, no campaign plan, ridiculous money going in, no loyalty, the corruption, it all adds up to failure by failure. Why are you going to persuade the Afghans to, pick up arms against technically locals of the Taliban and join this government who they consider just as corrupt, but maybe worse, because it has legitimacy in the international community. So let's jump into some of these quotes. And again, not all of these are going to come directly from the Afghan papers, the interviews with SIGAR. These are just, the whole idea of this is to bring it all from the horse's mouth. And this is an interview from a military college. We actually used this one last time. This is with Major Del Sam with the military college here, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And you can see it actually mentions the word unclassified. So these are directly meant to help the army in future operations. And this was in August 2009. We actually mentioned him last time, talking about how, before they don't really have a rule of law or justice system. It's done through, the elders. And the tribes, and then we're trying to come in and, you know, build all this authority that they have no, you know, previous history with. And we do bring it in, and then this is the sort of stuff we bring in, and they're like, why would we care? So listen to this. So we've trained police forces, but we don't have the next step to do anything, the justice thing. Initially, the police, and they still are for the most part, they're so corrupt that if your house gets robbed and you call the police to show up, the police will show up and rob your house a second time. So you're not really inclined to call the police to deal with any problems, because chances are they're going to hold you up for money one way or another. And then they talk about here how, you know, provide them the carrot, offer them better pay, because, you know, some of them, I'm sure they know is morally wrong, but some of these people obviously corrupt because they're just trying to get by. They're in a third world country that's been bombed to smithereens and been at war for 30 years at this point in 2009. Obviously, I'm not condoning doing this sort of behavior, but, you know, people do this sort of stuff when they're completely desperate, or I'm sure some of them was just using the power and the legitimacy to just take more and more and more, as if they was a warlord, because some of them probably were. And then they talk about how we put these checkpoints up and down the main roads all over the place, and the police were basically using as a toll booth. So just collecting money, just as it was in Warlord Inc. every time. So the Warlord Inc. was a US congressional investigation in 2008, 2009, about how, you know, the US privatized all the companies to bring their supplies for Afghanistan. Every time it had to come through, it had to pay off warlords, you know, it had to pay off police and army checkpoints. They have to pay off the governor. So they have to pay basically a racket and a bribe system. And again, the police are using the system, just like the Norwegian figure said, I mentioned about how about 30% of them would just use the arms and set up their own private militias with checkpoints. And it's just crazy. And this is, you know, part of the reason, again, the Afghans never really bought into the whole system, because they're like, you know, we sort stuff out between ourselves, our tribes, we have our own justice, the elders, we've sorted out for generations, and you're trying to bring in this alien system. They bring it in and it's corrupt, and then you're like, well, I thought you guys was meant to bring justice, and we've just been robbed again, you know, again contributing to why would we favor you over the Taliban. So this is one of the Afghan Papers interviews. This is a US military officer in 2016, and they're called Learned Lesson Interviews with SIGAR. And again, you can see this 2016. So the previous one was 2009. So it's been 7 years. Has anything changed? No. About a third of the Afghan local police, the ALP, seem to be drug addicts or Taliban. The ALP's main concern was getting fuel from the US unit. They always wanted fuel. I'm guessing they always want that fuel because they're going to sell it on to whoever is, you know, the highest bidder, or use it for themselves. And again, he said about a third of them seem to be drug addicts or Taliban. So there's no loyalty. It was just who is the highest bidder, basically. And one of them actually asked, you know, why did you sign up to the army? Good paycheck. Help you support the family. Basically, that's what it came down to. And if they could go somewhere else and make more money, they would. Just like the farmers, they're like, oh, we can give you money to stop growing opium. And then it's not worth it because you can make more money growing the opium. Or the police who are involved in the eradication, in the day they're working on the farms harvesting it with them because they can make way more money. So, when you're in a third world country that's kind of broken through war, people are going to obviously choose the better source of revenue. And again, there's no loyalty. Anyone who's in the army, most of them are not like believing in the cause, to Ahmad Karzai, yeah, America have come in with democracy. They're just like, yeah, maybe they'll win. We can make some money. And then when it goes up, we're like, oh, we'll just join the other side. And obviously the drug addicts plays into how much, opium is being sold basically in the country. And we can get to that a bit later. So this is Ryan Crocker in 2016. And he's a retired US diplomat and US ambassador to Afghanistan, 2011 to 2012. and acting ambassador. So at the time, and then US ambassador to Pakistan. So Pakistan, Afghanistan intimately tied together. Very important figure, and he has this to say. I'm going to show you a bit of audio.
To development, but here's something that is contradictory with both development and security. I mean, if you look at the Afghan police now, a horribly corrupt organization. That's retail corruption, obviously, not wholesale. But,
right.
The Afghan Special Forces, helped by us, can clear an area, but the police can't hold it. Not because they're outgunned or outmanned. It's because they are useless as a security force, and they're useless as a security force because they are corrupt down to the patrolman level. I don't mean to turn this into a pet rock fetish, but of all the painful lessons I carry out of my time in those two war zones, Iraq and Afghanistan, it's the deadliness of corruption at every level that is the starkest for me.
So if you didn't quite hear that, this is the full transcript, and this one, a lot of them were documents. They're about anywhere from 1 to 10 pages. This is the whole transcript of the interview. Also includes the audio, so 49 pages. Pretty good. So this is Ambassador Crocker speaking. The Afghan Special Forces, helped by us, can clear an area, but the police can't hold it. Not because they're outgunned or outmanned, it's because they are useless as a security force, and they're useless as a security force because they are corrupt down to the patrol levels, top down. And then he says, some of the hardest parts, starkest points of Afghanistan and Iraq was that there was corruption at every level. And again, he talks about how they're useless as a security force because they're corrupt down to the patrol level. Another official in one of these interviews, said to, the local elders, how is it, thousands of security forces and police and stuff can't fight against, 500 or 50 Taliban? And he's like, oh, it's not because they can't, it's because they choose not to, because they're corrupt. And they're not actually here to protect us. They're here to collect a paycheck and make money. And that's what it comes down to. That, I haven't even talked about the ineffectiveness, in these interviews and military colleges. They literally laugh about how bad the Afghan army forces are. And, just them firing near the target in target practice is good. Just the fact they can basically shoot near it is a win because they're so poor. We haven't even talked about that. So they're poor and they're completely corrupt, and the population are clearly aware that they're not there to help them, and they're there to basically for their own self reasons, money, power, whatever it may be. So again, this sort of sums it up well. So this is Lieutenant Colonel Augustine, and here previously, just the last paragraph, they're talking about how how the state sort of works. You have the governor, and then you have the police chief, and then the other guys, the people around them, they sort of run things. And then the interviewer asked, are they doing their job? Says, I think they're all making pretty good efforts. There was always a question of corruption with all the drugs and poppy production going on in Helmand. That was always these guys always had a question mark behind them, not just from me, but from higher headquarters, intelligence. Everybody else was always like, are these guys involved in drugs? That was always the thing behind every conversation. This ongoing chess game of corruption. Who's making money? How are they making money? It's an ongoing problem over there. So even, when they think they're doing a good job, they think they can trust them, they're always like, top down, he mentioned headquarters, intelligence, everybody. It's always like, are these guys, really doing what they say? A bit like Pakistan, are they really doing their side of the bargain? It was like with the eradication program of opium, the Americans and the West flip flopped. One minute they got eradicated, the next they're like, no, we're guarding their poppy fields because the farmers need it for money, and we're going to destroy them wanting us to be here. And they drive past, and they'd be like, the sort of tour guides of the officials and the police, and they go past all these fields that thriving with opium, haven't been harvested yet, and then they always seem to go to these places in Helmand that have basically been harvested a bit, and they eradicate it, and it was normally because someone powerful controlled those fields, a governor, a member of parliament, a police chief. So they drive past all these ones. Opium carries on thriving. It supplies 95% of the world opium in 2015, and they just completely failed because there's normally someone involved in it, because it's the most thriving trade in Afghanistan is opium. I mean, in 2000, the Taliban completely had a ban on it, and you can see the UN chart of the production's basically down to nothing. As soon as we invade, it goes right up, and that doesn't have to mean the CIA is the CIA is directly involved in the trade, or the West. This means you end up having to ally with these warlords because you're occupying a country and you're not really fighting against an army, so you've got to team up with whoever you can, and you've got to let things slide. Sure, yeah, there's a question of opium going on there, but he's a useful CIA asset. There was even questions about Hamid Karzai's brother, Wala Hamid Karzai, who did a lot of work with the CIA, and he even had questions that he was like massively involved in the opium trade. You can see a New York Times article about it. He ends up getting assassinated in 2010. Pretty sketchy circumstances for the technically almost vice president or the brother of the president. So even the top guy, you always have that question of is he he's helping us here, then is he helping us here because he knows we're turning a blind eye here, and that opium trade goes right up. And it seems that that sort of happened. I mean, yeah, getting assassinated after working with the CIA and being linked to the opium trade, always a great demonstration of democracy that you're building. So this is the last one we'll be looking at, and it sort of sums it up. Christopher Calendar, and this is again in 2016. And he was a retired US Army colonel, strategic advisor to 3 commanders in Afghanistan. So 3, I mean, I don't know the time frame of that because there was a lot of generals. But again, all these people, they aren't just some random guy overlooking it, or watching from afar. Like, these are people directly advising on the ground, ambassadors, and they're saying this behind the scenes where they don't think the information they're saying is going to get on full. They know they'll be quoted, and sometimes they could go anonymous, but they're saying some stuff that they really didn't think was going to come out. So here is how he describes it. The kleptocracy got stronger over time, to the point that the priority of the Afghan government became not good governance, but sustaining this kleptocracy. But because we never appropriately identified or framed the problem, we have a huge dispersion within the US government in ideas of what corruption is. I like to use a cancer analogy. Petty corruption is like skin cancer. There are always ways to deal with it, and you'll probably be just fine. Corruption within the ministries, high level, is like colon cancer. It gets worse, but if you catch it in time, you're probably okay. Kleptocracy, however, is like brain cancer. It's fatal. And then he talks here about, this is a question to him, was another obstacle the fact that corruption was dismissed as a cultural phenomenon or characteristic? And he says, oh God, yes, all the time. Afghans are naturally corrupt, and it's just a fact of life. You hear that from the state, and it's even a bit disconcerting. So yeah, that was spoken about a lot. Oh, it's just their culture. They're just a corrupt bunch. It's in the Afghan genes, their DNA, and their hair. It's just, it's in the air around there. Second, you get a smell of Afghan, you're signing up to small militias. You're doing this, you're robbing people. No. You're in a third world country that's been at war with the Soviets through the 80s, then the Civil War through the 90s, and then the Americans rock up all these years, funnel in loads and loads of money, like absolutely billions. I mean, just 143 billion on on reconstruction alone, training all these people, you're backing the government, and these people are desperate. Of course, there's going to be corruption. It's not an Afghan phenomenon. You're directly fueling it. And as the previous video said, the advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, we almost took the way of just allowing it. It seems like we preferred it, is what she said. So you can't just be like, oh, they're just a corrupt bunch. It's probably also just to justify to themselves, like, oh yeah, of course we can, have a perfect democracy. They're just, the Afghans, they're just corrupt, aren't they? So again, that sort of sums it up, a kleptocracy. But again, that all adds up to the failures of the war, the fact the population is just weighing it out because they don't really want to choose either side because they see them as almost the same. You have a Kabul bank that's completely corrupt. You have the police who are corrupt. You have the army who are corrupt, have no loyalty, desert it, ghost soldiers just funneling money to the point, I think it was in 2017 or something, the US got rid of 30,000 ghost soldiers. This isn't just like a few bad eggs. This is a system, where they're buying positions because they see it as being able to get more money and power for themselves. But anyway, I'll leave it there. I don't want to overdo it. Again, that was the Afghan Papers, a great insight into the war and what they really thought about these people and the so-called justice system they're bringing in that was completely corrupt, from the police, the army, to the government, through opium, checkpoints, and whatever else they got up to. And of course, obviously, the warlords, straight up criminals, just put in the government to please them. But anyway, we'll leave it there. Thank you for listening to the Truth Over Comfort show, and we'll see you soon.